Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Susan Squire, and I'm part of the Graphic Medicine Collective and have the lovely task of being the moderator today for this panel on outreach and patient education. And as you can see, we have a Skype presence and we have an actual presence as presenters. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then the order will be that our first presentation will be by Ryan Prout, who is our Skype presenter, and then our next presentation will be by Matteo Farinella. So let me tell you about them. Ryan Prout is a senior lecturer in Spanish at Cardiff University in Wales. His research interests are in contemporary Spanish and Latin American visual cultures and narrative, and his diverse publications on literature, film, and the graphic novel have addressed themes ranging from the transitional dog as skeuomorphic proxy, I love that, to gender and automobilism in Spanish film of the 1960s. And he has publications that are forthcoming, including a chapter on pain in Insensibles en la Herida, and on horror and Spanish parapsychology. He also has a book on neurodiversity in Spanish language visual cultures that's forthcoming. And he is an elected member of the University and College Union's National Executive Committee, where he represents LGBT members in UK higher education. So, welcome, Ryan. I'm now going to turn over to Matteo Farinella. He has received a PhD in neuroscience from University College London in 2013. Since then, he's been combining his scientific expertise with a lifelong passion for drawing, producing educational comics and illustrations. He is the author of Neurocomic, which I will say I own, and which I also happen to know has been translated into quite a number of languages. It's published with support of the Wellcome Trust, and he's also authored other books. In 2016, he joined Columbia University as a scholar in society and neuroscience to study the use of comics in science communication. So I want to welcome both of them, and Ryan, I think, take it away. It's yours.
There you go. Okay.
Yay.
First of all, thank you very much for that welcome. I'm very glad to be here, albeit in a kind of virtual capacity. At the same time, disappointed not to be able to be there in person. I was hospitalized earlier this year, and this wouldn't be very significant if I were traveling elsewhere in Europe, but there's no reciprocal agreement between the UK and the US. And so the issue of having received treatment in the last 6 months is a factor. I feel as if I've slipped into the gap between two models of healthcare, the socialized one and the for-profit one. And in my humble opinion, it's a shame that we don't seem able to find some way of allowing patients to exercise some autonomy and taking responsibility for our health without giving up the benefits of something that still resembles the NHS. 52 years after Solzhenitsyn completed cancer ward, this same conundrum of marrying patient autonomy with state provision of healthcare, as spelled out in Kostoglatov's conversation with a retired doctor friend, no longer enthralled to the Soviet bureaucracy, seems just as thorny. So the project I'm talking about is All Is Not Well, a graphic approach to issues around caregiving in the UK, particularly those that have arisen in the wake of the process begun under Mrs. Thatcher of deinstitutionalising care and shifting provision to communities. I'll say more about the content and purpose of the project, and first I want to outline how and why it developed. As a hispanist and research scholar, my interest in comics and graphic novels was led by my undergraduate teaching. I needed some prescribed reading for my content courses that students would have time to read. Since the introduction of enormous fees here, UK students spend a lot of their time in paid employment, and it's less realistic than ever to imagine that they will read Don Quixote cover to cover. I'm not sure it was ever realistic, but it's completely unrealistic. Fortuitously, the establishment in Spain just about 10 years ago of the National Prize for Comics favoured an environment where graphic novels were covered by the press and by critics, a development that went hand in hand with the expansion of Spanish sequential art to include themes considered serious by journalists, such as the economy, historical memory, illness, and the perceived greying of Spain's population. In this context, a graphic novelist such as Aleix Saló was able to emerge as the layperson's interpreter of the 2008 financial crash. He's been a frequent contributor to radio and television, and his trilogy of graphic novels about the experience and origins of the economic crisis in Spain and the EU became bestsellers by comic standards. Whereas over here, Alan Moore would be invited onto mainstream media to talk about Hollywood or comics, it's inconceivable that a graphic novelist would be asked to explicate the national economy, and this, I believe, is a significant pointer to the different cultural contexts in which sequential art exists in Britain and in Spain. So negotiating between these two comics cultures already involves an element of bridge building. The second person in that list that was on the previous slide to receive the Spanish National Prize for Comics was Paco Roca, for his graphic novel Wrinkles, Arrugas in Spanish, about Alzheimer's. In an interview with Roca that I organized in 2016, and which is coming out in the next volume of the International Journal of Comic Art, he said, Wrinkles and the Premio Nacional also made the media, press and television less reserved about covering comics and gave them a focus around which to do stories on comics. There had always been press and TV journalists who were fans, and until then, whenever it came to writing about comics or reviewing them, it had been a struggle because that attitude that views comics as being mainly for children was still there. The subject matter of Wrinkles made it very easy to justify giving it press coverage because it dealt with these apparently serious themes such as Alzheimer's disease and old age. Finally, it gave journalists who had always wanted to write about comics a text that they could write about, and Wrinkles gained coverage across the media. And ironically, he was criticized in some of his earlier work for depicting elderly people, and the editors would say, erase them from the picture. And in a recent article, interview article with him, he joked that now that's all he's asked to do. Every time he's kind of commissioned to do something, they want old people in it. Graphic medicine content then was instrumental in Roca's view in bridging the gap between sequential art and mainstream journalism. Though it's worth noting that since Wrinkles, no other title to win the National Comics Prize has had any aspect of medicine as its subject. A retrospective exhibition on Roca's work held at Madrid's prestigious Telefonica Gallery in 2015 demonstrated how both the perception of visual storytelling and the working practices of comic artists have changed. The exhibition began with examples of Roca's illustration work, including for adult magazines, and ended with cases full of photographs he'd taken of care homes and hospitals, and the copious research notes he'd made in order to create Wrinkles. I know that there's probably many examples we could come up with in the past of graphic novelists who've done a tremendous amount of research for texts like Hergé with the Blue Lotus, for example. But I think this kind of activist research is something relatively new. Published in 2007, Wrinkles has now sold more than 650,000 copies in Spanish, and is often bracketed together with Miguel Garriado's Maria and Me, an autobiographical text about bringing up a child with autism, and published in the same year as Wrinkles. Maria and Me and Wrinkles are the two graphic novels that I incorporated into my teaching in a course on minority voices in Spanish language cultures. And I found that students are engaged by the caregiving dichotomy that these graphic novels bring into view, and they allow the class to contrast Ayn Rand's objectivist dismissal of care with post-structuralist critiques of a chimerical independence. So that's a screen grab on the left of Ayn Rand with Donahue, I think, and in that interview, she's completely dismissive of why anybody would care about anybody else. You know, you just care about yourself and at most your family, and anything else she thinks is perverse. That compares with this fantastic piece between Judith Butler and Zenara Taylor, which I think students find very eye-opening in terms of how nobody is kind of really completely independent ever. So as well as teaching these texts, I've also published on them. And in the newfangled world of British academia, however, knowledge, learning and research are not considered valuable in their own right. And by government decree, the impact of research outputs also has to be a factor in deciding their worth. So I was invited to develop an impact narrative around the comics element of my research. And initially it seemed challenging to think how my work on Spanish comics could make an impact on British society or on the fiscal or creative economies of our Europhobic offshore island. I'm sure I don't need to tell you about the kind of parallel tracks that the US and the UK seem to be running on in terms of the politics.
Yeah.
Goodness knows what's going to happen next March. There are all kinds of scare stories at the moment. There won't be any drugs. There's not going to be any food in the shops. People are actually stockpiling food. It's quite an interesting time to be alive, I suppose. But going back to this, fortunately, I was lucky to find enthusiastic collaborators for this project in the Lakes International Comic Art Festival in Kendal, England, and in Jonathan Clode, a comics writer based in Cardiff. The collaboration with the festival led in 2016 to the co-production of several events in the 3-day programme, more or less amounting to a Spanish theme. Jordi Bernet was an invited speaker, and Paco Roca introduced a screening of the film version of Wrinkles, and also did a Q&A with Roberto Bartual, a comic scholar from Madrid. One of the bridges that I was trying to build with this element of the project was one that would connect a British comics festival with Spanish content. And admittedly, I'm biased as a Hispanist and as a Hispanophile, but I really do remain puzzled by the fact that despite producing some of the most interesting and accomplished graphic novels of the last 10 years, the work of Spanish artists and writers is relatively unknown outside Spain. If it was successful, the collaboration with the Lakes Festival may have made a small contribution to changing this. The screening of Wrinkles was well attended, and the issues the story raised of who is responsible for care of the elderly and how society should respond to the perceived epidemic of Alzheimer's clearly made a connection with the audience. What I learned from this collaboration, among other things, was that the language barrier is an important obstacle to bridging the divide between comics cultures. Unlike some of the other foreign guests at the 2016 Lakes Festival, Paco Roca doesn't speak fluent English, and even with someone willing to interpret, this seemed to have an isolating effect. I found it odd that someone with Roca's talents for storytelling and drawing should have so few people interested in talking to him, though this experience cannot be attributed to British froideur alone. In Emotional World Tour, the graphic novel Roca co-wrote with Miguel Garrido about their shared experience of doing the Spanish festival circuit in the wake of the unusual media interest in Wrinkles and Maria and Me. He recounts long lines for signings by genre authors compared with slow business at the table reserved for the social comics writers. One of his few customers on that tour demands that Spain's greatest living graphic novelist, quote, "do me a Batman," with the dedication and the book. An anecdote that he parlays in a panel in Emotional World Tour that encapsulates his sense of humor. The disproportionate interest in social and genre comics repeated itself in the UK, and it seemed appropriate to lend that journey some symmetry by asking Roca to dedicate my copy of the catalogue of the Telefonica exhibition with a Batman, which is the picture on the right. So I'm going to talk now about another thread to the impact narrative, this one less about trying to bring Spanish graphic novelists into the purview of British festival programming than about challenging stereotypes around caregiving as a practice. The bridge between the two strands is the precedent set by comics like Maria and Me and Wrinkles in Spain, where the fact that they broke into the mainstream meant that questions around care of the elderly and of people with autism achieved greater prominence in the Spanish press. Could those lessons be applied in a British context? Paco Roca's work and the research he did in order to create Wrinkles exposes gaps between ideals of caregiving and the realities. He shows, for example, that the fact that care institutions for the elderly are meant to cater to residents but have to be sold to their younger family members means that there's a pointless concentration of facilities, such as swimming pools, that are more for show than for use. Would those insights be relevant to caregiving in the UK? Collaborating with a comics writer, Jonathan Clode, whose writing and editing work on To End All Wars was recognised in 2014 with an Eisner nomination, made it more practicable to work on this part of the project. Furthermore, Jonathan's daytime job as a care manager and his experience of the sector brought to the project questions driven by frustrations confronted at the coalface of care. In some ways, caregiving and the academy are quite far apart, but the more we talked, the more it became apparent that from the viewpoint of a conscientious employee, there were many similar challenges that have to do with negotiating the gap between a management culture driven by targets and a will really to help clients in care or to teach students in higher education. Both HE and the care sector, it seems, have been affected by the growth of a layer of management that often feels divorced from the work of those who are providing the services that are nominally the principal function of our respective sectors. So at the beginning of our collaboration, we knew we wanted to create something about caregiving and a conversation between someone coming at this from an academic perspective and somebody else bringing the eye of a practitioner to the same field, focused this something more precisely on 4 points. And I put them up on the slide here. So we wanted to expose and counter the tendency in the British press to represent care always and only in terms of scandal and sensationalism. I'm not familiar enough with the press in the States to know if that's something we have in common, but I do know that, for example, that doesn't exist in the Spanish press. Whereas here, every time care occurs in the press, it's from that angle. So we also wanted to centre the caregiver in narratives about care. Running out of sellotape. To underscore the poor remuneration of caregiving and the failure of the monetary reward system to bring into line the value of the work that caregivers do with a commensurate material reward. And that seems to be really at the heart of the problem that we have in the UK about the perception of care as an occupation and caregivers as people who are absolutely vital to the functioning of the society, but are really held in very low esteem in some ways. And we wanted to make care and caregivers a more significant part of the graphic medicine landscape and to query the semantic perimeters of medicine. So to illustrate what I was saying about the care in the British press always being approached in terms of scandal and sensationalism is really easy. I mean, I found these stories in a couple of clicks. And this is very representative. This content emphasizes abuse and shortcomings to the exclusion of almost anything else and never situates its sensationalist detail in the context of a sector being run on a shoestring and staffed by caregivers who are by and large generous people doing their best to look after others while struggling themselves to make ends meet. So an element of the collaboration I'm doing with Jonathan then has been about turning around the scandal. And one of our first ideas was for a strip that used the fly on the wall genre to expose not some sensationalist failing of a care home where residents are gagging on their breakfast rule, but instead to uncover other scandals. And listed 4 here. The scandal of the low pay caregivers receive. The scandal of the army of young people and children who are invisible caregivers taking up the slack left by the so-called care in the community. In some of the interviews we did, there's really shocking stories about this, about children who are barely old enough to look after themselves being put in the position of care for disabled and sick parents. Another scandal that we wanted to address was the expectation that the same caregivers who are paid the minimum wage are expected to be resourceful and creative entrepreneurs who paper over the gaps in the system. And I'm repeating a point here, I guess, but also to emphasize the top-heavy management of the care sector that misallocates resources to the fulfillment of targets instead of enabling clients to lead more fulfilling lives. The Kindness of Strangers is a strip that I wrote for the All Is Not Well website, and it's being illustrated by Jacob Phillips, and it addresses the first of these 4 alternate scandals. A caregiver who works in a hospice helps make the last days of dying patients dignified and comfortable, and brings solace to the relatives and friends left behind. At the end of the strip, as the care worker clocks off and gathers her goods to leave the hospice, the reader is left to wonder, are her tears provoked by another emotionally demanding day at work, or by the past due notice in her bag, a reminder that the provision of essential services to her home will be cut off if payment isn't made immediately? But the question that's supposed to ask is, how do we reconcile end-of-life care with people living on the breadline? And something I think that Jacob's done fantastically in this panel and in the strip is to visualize the element of the story which sees this room as the central character, and the shift in the light and the move from the diurnal to the nocturnal and the cyclicality involved in this as the narrative. Although it doesn't address the issue of child caregivers, Eliza Wolfson's contribution to the project Now and Then does give us an insight on the effects of the privatization of care, as does the design by Matt Soffer of the website's banner that shows a door in a residential street, which serves to occlude the caregiving relationship, the fact of interpersonal dependence, and the identities of the caregiver and the client. I think he's very effectively in that banner and gets at the way that the privatization of the care sector, while good in many ways, and I guess many people weren't happy living in institutions, on the other hand, has kind of hidden a lot of what people do. So these are strips from A Spoonful of Sugar, drawn and written by Mishi Mateas, and she addresses here the third alternate scandal I've enumerated. In interviews with caregivers, she was struck by the versatility and resourcefulness required of someone tasked with providing care, something that her strip brings to the surface vividly, both in the visual and the textual components. Interviews with other caregivers indicate that the high rate of turnover in the sector further exacerbates this need for thinking on one's toes, as employees are often literally dropped into the deep end and expected to look after clients whose needs are very complex and who may be experiencing, for example, not just dementia, but both dementia and cancer. And so another thing that's kind of struck me through doing this project is how political the difference between nursing and care is. As a patient, if you're being helped by somebody who's termed in the NHS a health worker and somebody else who's termed a nurse, it can feel like two quite similar experiences, but that hierarchy within the system seems very, very robust. So using a crossover between Shakespearean rhetoric and management, and management-ese, the language of managers, as its underpinning conceit, Equivocation, the strip written by Jonathan and illustrated by Ben Campbell, addresses the fourth of the alternate scandals that I proposed. Imperious managers keep themselves at arm's length from the nitty-gritty of caregiving, while their lowly serfs attend to the messier and more viscous needs of the actual clients. The visual references to Shakespeare, updated to a contemporary idiom, bolster the point that the disingenuous use of language to conceal inequalities is nothing new, but has found a novel application in creating hierarchies within the care sector. Other contributions to the project, including Lucy Bergonzi's It's All About Choice and Tamsin Walker's I See You, keep in sight the fact that caregiving is just as much about the needs of patients with mental health issues as it is about the needs of people with physical illnesses and impairments or disabilities. So the first budget for the project that we put together was based on contributions of artwork and stories being secured on a pro bono basis. But when we thought more about this, it struck both me and Jonathan that there was something not quite right about a project that aimed to address poor remuneration, among other things, asking collaborators to work completely for free. The funding for the project from the Economic and Social Research Council and from Cardiff University's College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences didn't allow us technically to pay collaborators for their work as such, so collaborators have received an honorarium. Making arguments like the one we did to my administrative colleagues in the university has been a further part of the process of trying to bridge the gap between town and gown. I think that's one kind of element of this project that does kind of address the way we work remit. That was something that we discovered in the process of doing this, that trying to find a rhetoric that would allow that kind of funding to happen without actually saying that's what we were doing. The most challenging part of the process, however, and one that remains incomplete, is making connections with caregivers themselves. I want to run a workshop where caregivers, artists, writers, and policymakers have a chance to interact, and making this happen has proven to be difficult. And I think there are several factors at work here. The higher education impact mandate for research is, in my view, essentially an instruction for scholars and academics to become lobbyists. And this is much more practicable if one comes from a background where contacts with politicians and other members of the establishment are easily nurtured. Higher education in the UK is very much being gentrified, and this sort of requirement will be well suited to some recent generations of academics, but isn't so well adjusted to those of us who come into higher education from working class backgrounds. Another practical consideration is the availability of care workers and their ease of travel. Those who work long hours and have limited discretionary income are precisely the people we're trying to reach in this project, and who are also those for whom taking a day off work and travelling is least convenient. Having said all that, though, we haven't given up, and this workshop, as well as a set of recommendations about what needs to change for caregivers in the UK, in the form of an illustrated guide that uses the resource that we're assembling through the website, are the next parts of the process. We will also be putting online a synthesis of the interviews that Jonathan Clode has been doing with caregivers from around the UK. And longer term, we want to collect the strips contributed to the website in a print anthology. The openness of Julie Tate at the Lakes Festival to new programming content has allowed this project to have some impact on awareness within the UK festival circuit of the Spanish graphic novel. The 2016 iteration of the festival included Spanish content that might not otherwise have been considered. And the website's visibility has had some impact for the creative collaborators. Both Mishi and Lucy Bergonzi have been approached for further work on the basis of their contributions, and frames from Lucy's script for All Is Not Well were reproduced in Nicholas Streeton's book, published earlier this year, the first one on this theme, I think, that narrates the history of women cartoonists and graphic artists, and was connected with an exhibition on the same subject at London's Cartoon Museum. Impacting government policy on caregiving at the level of either Welsh or UK politics is more challenging, perhaps because the issues at stake are so much more systemic. To continue to make the effort, though, is worthwhile. We had an odd thing happen earlier this year in the UK where the National Statistics Office reported 20,000 unexplained extra deaths. Nobody's really been able to get to the bottom of this. Assuming that it's a blip, the pattern predicted longer term for the UK population is one that sees people living longer generally and living more of their longer lives with the need for social or personal care. And until the social esteem in which caregivers are held begins to match the personal esteem in which their patients and clients hold them, it also seems likely that there will be a continuing recruitment crisis. So persisting with activism in the realm of care for scholars, creative artists, and politicians alike is also worthwhile, I would argue, because it means engaging with a very deep-seated question of where altruism belongs in our social structures and what we determine is meant by dependence and independence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I think maybe we have 2 minutes or so for questions for Ryan Prout, if anybody wants to ask one, and you would just come up here and ask it, because I think it may be difficult to connect questions once we switch formats.
Yeah.
So we'll just do that. So if anybody has a question, I invite you to come up here and ask. Okay, come on up.
First of all, can you hear me?
Can you hear Ryan?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. I really love it. My question is any of these projects will be applicable to care in the US, and how can we transition to healthcare providers like I am to taking care of patients better, especially in hospice? So it's like if we want to change hospice care in America, because I seem like everything seems to be similar. There's disparity between the provider care and then the patient care. So how can I use your material? How can I learn from material and apply it to make a change in the U.S. care? So that's my question. I don't know if that works.
Oh, okay. Well, if I can be a bit anecdotal in answering that, the story that I wrote and which Jacob Phillips is illustrating arose from something that happened while Jonathan and me have been collaborating on this project, which is nearly for 2 years now. And then, very sadly, in the course of that time, Jonathan's mother died. And the care that she received at the end of her life seems as if it was really exquisite. And it's kind of like a national pastime in the UK to knock the NHS. It can be very frustrating at times because of this sort of problem of not having much autonomy as a patient. But I think most people in the UK recognise that when it comes to the crunch, the NHS really is there for people. And I would hope that some of the content of the project perhaps would be useful in trying to make the argument for, if not a switch lock, stock and barrel to a socialised care system, then at least to one that doesn't leave some people to die in a way that lacks dignity and respect.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. I think we've used our 2 minutes. So Ryan, thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to Matteo Farinella. So thank you. Matteo, would you like to give it here or over there?
I don't know. Am I supposed to stay here? Or?
I don't know. People may not be able to see you if you keep sitting. That's my
Because I
one
don't know how to
concern. But
control
I
the
don't know that we have a advisor here.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. As Susan mentioned in the introduction, I don't work in medicine or healthcare, so I feel like I want to tell you a bit more about my background to explain how I ended up here. I did a PhD in neuroscience, and not even a very medical field of neuroscience. I was doing computational neuroscience, which is a very theoretical part of neuroscience, trying to figure out how the brain computes information. But at the same time, I always had this parallel passion for comics. I've been reading comics since I was a kid, and I like to draw, so I slowly started to draw my own comics. But these two things always really clashed in my mind. Like I never could see any connection between the two. So I kept the two very separate for a very long time. I wasn't actively hiding my identity as a comic artist, but I wasn't really volunteering the information at work. I was trying to be a very professional scientist and then just draw my comics in the weekends and evenings. Until toward the end of my PhD, when I started talking to a new member of our lab, Anna Ross. She was a neuroscientist as well. She was a postdoc in my lab, but she was the first one from my scientific academic world who, when she heard about my comic, she didn't just dismiss it as a kind of a fun hobby, but she was really excited because she had this background in science communication. She did a whole master in science media production, and so she really encouraged me to use my comics to do science communication. And I have to say at the beginning I was very skeptic. I mean, I thought it would be fun to do, but I didn't think there would be an audience. I associated science communication mostly with science journalism or documentaries because those are the most popular formats. But Anna was very persistent, and I have to give her credit for that. And she also convinced me to apply together for a Wellcome grant. And for those of you who don't know them, they are this amazing institution based in the UK who support a lot, like most of scientific research. My whole lab was funded by the Wellcome Trust, but they also care about making their science accessible and making it open access, and they have a whole branch dedicated to science communication and public engagement. So they give these grants for new projects in science communication. And to my great surprise, they decided to fund this project of Neurocomic, a graphic novel about the brain, which was published in 2013, right before I finished my PhD, and was published by Nobrow, a UK publisher. And without trying to be modest here, it was like way more successful than I expected. As Susan mentioned, it got a lot of attention and quickly got translated in, I think now there are more than 9 foreign editions. So really, this was like beyond our initial plan. In the proposal for the Welcome Trust, we were planning to self-publish a few hundred copies and give them away, kind of, at science festivals. And I discovered there was a real interest in this. So that kind of hijacked my career. And after my PhD, I just started drawing comics, educational science comics for a while. And I also started to kind of think more seriously about this thing. And I quickly realized that I wasn't the first nor the last, especially in the last 10 years, there've been more and more of these graphic novels about science. In the beginning, mostly about scientists, so like biographies of famous scientists. And I think because that's kind of the format that the graphic novel is still mostly associated with. But more recently, both Science and Nature, the two major scientific publications, had short web comics on their websites. And really, I started to kind of pay more attention and collect every kind of comics, animation, or web comics about science I could find on this website, cartoonscience.org. And I have now at least more than 80 publications. And this was really very much inspired by graphic medicine. That's also how I started kind of paying attention to graphic medicine, which kind of started like this, like as a kind of way to create a community and establish a field. And so I'm kind of trying to do something similar with comics about science, although we are way behind, I think. Because the number of comics is increasing, but there isn't very much written about these comics. There's very careful analysis or studies of science comics. And so this leads me to my current project. So I recently returned to research, thanks to this really special position at Columbia University. So this very ambitious title of Presidential Scholar in Society and Neuroscience is essentially a postdoc that aims to combine neuroscience with other fields in the humanities. So you can apply with whatever proposal you want. So my proposal was really trying to start to study seriously these science comics and if possible, so measure who are the audiences. So like I want to understand really if they can become a tool alongside more traditional mediums like writing and video and audio. And I want to know who's reading these comics, what are the effects, and what are the challenges as well, and particularly compared to graphic medicine. And since I'm a neuroscientist, I'm also interested if there is any effect. I would like to understand or know more about what are the underlying cognitive mechanisms. And this is all in the attempt to make better, more effective comics when it comes to science. So this is what I've been trying to do for the past 2 years. I started, as any scientist would start, just looking for papers and trying to do a review of empirical studies on science comics. And needless to say, there aren't very many. I literally found only a dozen. I mean, I'm talking about empirical studies. So there are a lot of qualitative studies, for example, of teachers that gave comics to their classroom and they reported they liked them. And this is it's all great, but I'm trying to quantify the effect a bit more. And really, these are the studies. Like I think the best ones in terms of design were these two, from Osler, Boomer, Spiegel, and colleagues. And most of these were done in the classroom, which again, it's great. It makes sense. It's going to be the first application for educational comics. But I'm kind of struggle with this traditional comics as for children. I want to show that I think there's potential beyond the classroom. Anyway, these are all very different, done in different settings, different subjects. So we shouldn't really group them together. But if we want to group them together, the message I took from them is that comics are not necessarily then textbooks when it comes to learning, to knowledge acquisition. They're equivalent, which for some people it may be news as well. But comics were better student engagement. So students enjoyed them more and were interested in reading more about the subject. And the most interesting part for me is that the few studies that measured that, those two highlighted, show that these effects were more pronounced for students with less scientific background, so either non-science majors or students that reported to be less interested in science. Those were benefiting more from the comics. And this for me is exciting because I think it shows that actually the best application for comics may not be in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. So it could be a way to reach all those people that kind of gave up on science after high school, and they would never go and read a New York Times article about science or watch a documentary. But comics could be a way to bring them back into science and re-engage them in science. So part of what I'm doing is trying to test this, replicate the studies on adults or with online studies. And that's going very slowly and probably is less interesting to you, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I also very quickly started to look beyond the empirical studies. So I started thinking about a bit more interdisciplinary and started to read a lot of research in psychology, cognitive science, and educational science about what I came to see as kind of the ingredients of comics, so visualization, narrative, and metaphors. And these are the three things I'm trying to study. Visualization is the most obvious for you here, so I'm not going to talk about that. And narrative as well. You know narratives are engaging. I want to really talk about, metaphors and a bit of narrative, because I really became fascinated with this literature about metaphors. And just to just put into context why this is important, because one of the main challenges we have in science communication, science education, is that most reporting is about sciences that lend themselves to personification, so biology or medicine. Because as humans, we are naturally self-absorbed. We care about us and other humans and maybe cats and dogs, but we're not very good at thinking like very large scale or very small scale, both in space and time. And I think those are the real challenge when it comes to science communication. How do we communicate big systems that go beyond the individual and even like multi-generational systems? So in a way, this is the main difference I see from graphic medicine. Graphic medicine is very much rooted here. So I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I feel like it makes sense that graphic medicine is leading the way in the use of comics for communication, because often you deal with very intimate personal stories, which are naturally more engaging for the audience. But what I really want to try to communicate are the other ends of the spectrum. And so that's the problem, because there are no humans, there's no clear narrator, there is no clear protagonist there. And narratives need protagonists. There is another old literature on narrative persuasion, which, I don't have time to go into it, but it's very fascinating. People studying narrative as a tool for behavioral change, induced behavioral change. And to summarize it in 2 panels, that's the message, that it's not like one format is better than the other, but science often use expository format, even science journalism, which it works. I mean, it's very clear, but it puts all the weight on the receiver. And narrative is this alternative cognitive format where it seems like it's much easier to follow and to engage for the readers. So you can learn in the similar concepts, but in a different way, more emotional way. The problem that narratives, as we know, need characters. And in all this so-called cold science, we don't have characters. But comics can kind of do this very cheap trick that we can create characters when there are none. And this is something I see over and over in science comics. So in psychologically distant subjects like ocean biology or evolution before there were humans. Or in my own field of neuroscience, which is a very human-centered subject, but is still kind of abstract and invisible for most people. We can literally create these characters, bring them into the brain, and I think the idea is that these characters serve as a guide, as a proxy for the reader to engage on a more emotional level with these otherwise abstract concepts. And another way that comics use characters is by kind of animating this, again, abstract scientific objects. Larry Gonick, who's one of the pioneers of this field, really has been publishing these cartoon guides since the 80s, way before anyone was talking about science comics. And he does this all the time. He's really a master of this. So from proteins to mathematical functions, he turns them into these like very easy cartoony characters. For example, the function can be a monster that ingests the X and produce a Y. And I think these are interesting because most people would just look at them and say, okay, these are just comics, just cartoon characters. We don't pay too much attention to them, but I think when it comes to science education, they're really important because there is this, again, other big field of literature in psychology that looked at metaphors not as a linguistic tool, but as a cognitive tool. Most famously, Lakoff and Johnson, in their book Metaphors We Live By in the 80s, started to point out that the way we think about abstract subjects, and the classic example is time, one of the few abstract things we all have to deal with, is very much in metaphorical terms. So we talk, if you pay attention to our language, we talk about time as an object moving toward us, facing us. And Lakoff and Johnson argue that this is not, again, it's not just a language thing. This reflects the way we think about time. And we wouldn't be able to think about abstract objects without metaphors. And so, yeah, there's this whole theory of structure mapping, and some other psychologists like Deirdre Gentner extended this into science, research, and education. And she showed that, again, metaphors are really a key component when it comes to scientific understanding. So, for example, the first scientists, when they started to look at electric circuits, something we cannot see, they used their framework for water systems. And you can literally map every, like, element by element, a water system to electric circuit. And again, these are not just poetic tools, but they have a heuristic value. So they allow us to come up with ideas like the flow of an electric current. These are things that really shape our science. And so, yeah, here I'm trying to visualize metaphors as a metaphor, as these glasses, these like lenses, these tools that scientists use. And again, coming back to graphic medicine, you do it all the time, especially when you're trying to visualize invisible concept like inner feelings or psychological feelings. But I think this is really intrinsic, not just according to me. Many scholars pointed out that this is something really intrinsic into comics. Comics are built on metaphors, and especially these like large-scale metaphors. And I think this could be particularly useful when it comes to communicating science. And again, I see this over and over in the science comics, from the most classic ones like the immune system as this kind of army fighting back the invaders, from space-time that we can think of as a rubber sheet, and heavier objects deform it more, so they create gravitational attraction. Or in my own field, again, of neuroscience, the way we talk about the brain is very much based on this metaphor of neurons, brain cells as trees, and brain as a forest, which is the way I represented the brain in Neurocomic. And it's interesting because at the time I wasn't really aware of all this literature on metaphors. It's just something I did kind of spontaneously because literally that's the way we talk in neuroscience. We talk about dendritic trees, axonal arborizations, spines. So it seems like just like a nice thing to do, but I now believe this has an educational value because I can talk about the brain all day, but you're not going to see a brain. But you have all seen a forest, you all seen a tree. So if I present the brain in this format, you all have this kind of innate embodied understanding of what the brain may look like. And so, yeah, that's why I think I really become interested in metaphors. I also want to make clear, I don't think metaphors are the silver bullet that we should use all the time. I'm just saying, I think we should study the effects of metaphors, or metaphoric framing. And there are some initial studies on this. A particularly interesting one for this community, I think, is Hauser and Schwartz. They did a study where they studied the metaphor of fight against cancer. It's a language we use a lot to motivate the patients, but they found it could have the sort of side effect of discouraging preventive behaviors in healthy patients because we don't associate the idea of self-limiting behaviors with like strength and aggressiveness. We don't want to stop doing something. So again, metaphors, not all metaphors are good metaphors. I mean, they can have positive sides and downsides. They can lead you astray. again, extending this metaphor of metaphors, these lenses kind of distort the original picture. So we should be careful. We should understand carefully that they bring into focus some useful details, but they also blur some others. And so what I would like to see is really scientists working together with literary scholars and communicators and cartoonists. Why not? I think we are kind of experts in metaphors, to really try to map out these metaphors and try to understand what are the potential benefits and downsides of the metaphors, which is not how it's done at the moment. Most scientific metaphors emerge kind of by accident. Historically, someone proposed one, and then some sticks and some don't. We don't really know why. But the fact that it does stick, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a useful metaphor. I mean, a classic example from science communication, again, is the metaphor. Again, we don't think of them as metaphor, but the greenhouse effect, this term that was initially used to describe climate change, and is a metaphor. It works like a greenhouse. It traps the sunlight. But it may not be the best metaphor because it may convey this sense of protection and comfort. Greenhouses are a good thing. And that's maybe why it has been largely abandoned, because it may not transmit the urgency of the problem. So yeah, I just want to see more studies about these things, and I'm trying to study them myself. If you want to know more about any of these things, I wrote this article for the Journal of Science Communication with way more references that you may want, all about science comics and this kind of related field. And there's also a more reader-friendly version for American scientists with less references, but more pictures, more examples. And of course, you can, just like follow me on Twitter. I talk about science comics all the time. On my website, or on cartoonscience.org, especially if you find any new science comics I'm not aware of, please send them my way. I'm really trying to follow the example of graphic medicine that, like, in 10 years managed to build this community and establish itself as a field. And of course, I think there's some overlap, but there are, as I try to make clear, there are some different areas to explore in science comics. And so that's it, 20 minutes. Thank you so much.
So once again, we have time for questions. In fact, we've got a nice amount of time for questions. So I invite you to come up and give a question. And I don't know where you want to sit to answer. Do you want to sit or stand?
I don't want you to turn. I can sit back with you.
So in a number of other fields as well, the magic occurs through the use of pictures. And it's gotten me to thinking, if somehow we are activating circuits involving the inferior parietal lobule, which words don't do, and how that might be having an effect that heretofore we've been unaware of, and I'd like to know what you think about that.
Okay, that's a very good specific question. I am very bad at neuroanatomy, so actually, I couldn't really speak. I think there aren't many studies about what kind of brain areas these circuits are activating. So yeah, someone who's doing more brain imaging studies, Neil Cohn, on comics, but that's much more about the grammar of comics, how we read comics. In terms of activation, definitely visuals are attractive, and it is kind of a new trend. I'm also kind of skeptic. There are all these claims that I read online that the brain processes visuals 60% faster. I don't know where that comes from. I don't think it's such a clear relationship. I think the content of the visuals is important, and that's why I'm more interested in metaphors now than visual per se, because some pictures may not add much information, but some pictures may add a lot of information and may help you, again, bring all these structures, these conceptual structures that you have in a domain and apply them to a new domain. That's the theory behind metaphors. It really establish new connections. For example, if I say a neuron is like a tree, you know what a tree is, and so you can make the connection and apply all that knowledge to a neuron. So those are the kind of pictures that I think would activate something, but I don't know where. Yes.
Well, I first wanted to gently chastise you for breaking the fundamental rule of neuroscience, which is that any conversation of neuroscience have to mention Santiago Ramon y Cajal.
Oh, I usually do. Now you make me feel guilty.
No, I'm sorry.
He's my hero. I talk about him all the time.
I meant it playfully. But I do want to, I'm curious, did the discussion of the description of dendritic arbors begin with him, and if not, when did we start talking about arbors?
So that's something I usually talk about when I focus more on the on the neuroscience side. I can probably find you a presentation with Cajal. Yeah, so Cajal, for those of you who don't know, was considered kind of the pioneer, the father of modern neuroscience, because he was the first one who looked at the brain under the microscope at the beginning of the 20th century and understood that. So before then, there was this debate whether the brain was made of cells or this kind of this mix of cells fused together. Cajal said, no, it's made of cells, and he showed these beautiful pictures of neurons, and he drew them by hand. There wasn't really any other way back then. So it's amazing artist, and really with this drawing, he started to demonstrate that they were individual cells, and he started to describe the cells as trees.
He actually.
Yeah. So he created the metaphor. That's why I don't get any credit for that. That's a classic metaphor. And I think then the old language of neuroscience kind of was built onto that. But I think scientists are not very aware of it. Like we just take it for granted. Historians are much more attentive to these kind of things. And I think scientists should pay more attention to them, become more aware. Yes.
Come up. Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, Whit Taylor this morning talked about how fear-based education doesn't work, and then you mentioned something kind of along the same vein with metaphors and thinking about we have to be careful that they're not too friendly because they can also do harm in that way. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, what's the anecdote? What do you think does work to communicate science?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's for me is really the problem. I feel like we don't think about this thing carefully enough. Yeah, and I loved Whit Taylor talk because there is a lot of research. We're reading some similar research that, like, how do you engage people? I don't know anything about health education, but a classic example in science communication is climate change, which has been like, so far we use this like very aggressive, very scary language, and it is shown now that this doesn't work because people, again, this is basic psychology. People, like, you pay more attention to stuff you like. If the first thing I tell you that everything is terrible and there's nothing you can do, you're gonna stop listening. So even if everything is terrible, we should have more strategy there. And so find the right balance. Like I feel like we should start with the positive part and then like easing the negative part. But it's hard. Yeah.
Not to dispute the notion about
You
negative.
should come up. I hate to say it, but I think.
Not to dispute the notion that the fear campaigns don't work, but Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth did do pretty well.
That's true.
And that was pretty much a fear-based campaign.
It didn't change much our behavior, though. So there are different parameters. People are looking at. So climate change is a good example because I think many things are confounded. Often we talk about people not believing climate change. Actually, most people do believe in climate change. The problem is that then you don't do anything about it. There was this very good study. I don't remember the author. I think it may have been Khan. But basically, the message was that when you look at it, even people that believe in climate change, if then you ask them, how likely it is to affect your community, or your family, your children, or your country, then people gave very low scores. So like we always think, it's true, but it's going to affect someone else, some other place. So that's the problem. One thing is like showing the data and people believe you. The second step is affecting behavior. So people actually engage on it on an emotional level and think, okay, this is about me. I need to do something about it myself. That's the really hard part. And that's why I feel like where narratives and visuals and metaphors really play a big part.
I wanted to mention that Cajal, of course, also wrote narratives, didn't he?
Oh yeah, it was like
Yeah,
science fiction
Laura
story.
Otis has a wonderful collection of Cajal's science fiction stories. Yeah. So, yeah. Other comments or questions? You have one. Yes.
I think one of them's more of a comment, and it's really just about something simple, which is connection. And I think that's what we're doing at this conference. And to your question of the gentleman overseas, that we talk about denationalization of things, and maybe it's more in service of a global community. But I think that you're faced with an interesting challenge in what you're trying to study, because you're studying something that's emerging. And so I'm wondering how you're thinking about approaching an emerging way of teaching and communicating, and are there studies that you can design so that as this is emerging, you don't want to shape it in a way that you're affecting how it's being studied, but can you do a parallel? And can you do a controlled study that's an emerging study, where maybe you won't have the answers to it, but that's one of the things that came up for me, because
That's a very good question.
yeah, and I think that, for me, and just knowing my brain and my neuroscience, I really like when somebody can show me a picture of something that is complex, because I think in a complex way and I can get it and move on. But other people, they need that complexity because they're so detail-oriented that it helps them see something. And so as an educator and as somebody trying to help people to health, you kind of have to figure out who's where.
Yeah.
And then I wonder how that translates to your research, because I don't think you can make a blanket statement that, this comic's going to have this effect, because I think it's going to have different effects on different personalities and different learning styles. But I think the key is emotions, and how can you grab that person so that they start someplace, and then maybe the sequencing of the information that comes after it to affect behavior change.
Definitely. No, I mean, I don't know if that's even a question. It's like a very good point and something I'm really struggling with. And I always try to make it very clear, I don't want to give the impression that I don't say like comics are good for everything and they're going to solve our problem. You say different learning styles and different also like level of science literacy and visual literacy. I think, those are all things we should try to disentangle, and I don't know how to do it. I'm trying to
Because that's what I'm curious
Yes,
about.
yes.
Like, how does your brain, as this researcher, think about this complexity and how to get your hand around this monster in a way that...
And also, I have to admit, my disciplinary shortcomings, because I think I started with a very like analytical scientist way. Like, I'm gonna show the connection. It's gonna be one-to-one, and then I realized it's not gonna work like that. So now I'm much more interested, instead of just showing a number, trying to really think about what's effective for who, and also what subject. I mean, I'm talking about science. As I said, it goes from the incredibly big to the incredibly small, and they're probably gonna need different strategies and have different audiences. So, I think essentially the answer is there's a lot of research to be done, and I'm not trying to answer all these questions. I wish more people would come in this field and start looking at this.
Could I intervene? I realized I should have asked people to say their names.
Yeah.
Could everybody who's asked the question just say your name so that other people know who you are, starting with you and going backwards?
I'm Angela Santavica.
Fantastic. Who else? You?
David Hadley.
I'm Zhang.
And there was one more question, yes? Aaron.
Okay, how?
Aaron Freeman.
All right, thank you.
And there was one more.
And there was one more.
I'm Kara Bonnelly.
Thank you so much. And tell us your name.
Tom Dijsberg. Great talk, Matteo. So, one question is, in order for both of these fields, and they're somehow related, science and medical cartooning, to move ahead, there has to be at some point a quantifiable added value, right? I mean, if I take your example, it will be functional MR. I see an area of the brain lightening up because there's more blood flow, simple. And then what does that have to do with knowledge retention? The next step is knowledge application that eventually gets into some quantifiable metrics that is either an Amazon, 3 stars, or 5 thumbs up or down. But then the next thing is going to be really, hardcore numbers. And you need those in order to, on the medicine side, to get to some reimbursement at some point here, or NHS actually in a European system, to say that they have a code for it, to cover it. So that's cost effectiveness. It takes about 5 to 15 years to get those numbers through. For science, it would be that you retain that knowledge. You actually move more kids up to the next level. They do better in standardized tests and all that sort of stuff. That's what this field needs to move beyond the Kickstarter campaigns and the pro bono work and the governmental grants. Mm-hmm. So do you have any crystal ball on, there should be a, potentially it's too early, but there should be a track on business models in that area, to actually move this ahead and go beyond, the startup grants. Any idea?
It's a big question. I mean, also I want to just not push back, but clarify, because I started, again, like you, this very quantitative approach, but I don't know, I think we also, it depends, you say you needed to move forward, but yeah, you're saying to get grants, essentially. I think we need that only to convince SSS or NSF, but I don't think numbers are going to convince everyone. I mean, that's kind of the point of doing this. So that's why also, I'm doing this interdisciplinary postdoc where I'm still trying to do some empirical studies, but also taking the time to read about the history of science, make more, qualitative arguments based on psychology, cognitive science. Because I feel in a way, there's a lot of research already. I started looking at science comic studies, but then there are already all these studies on narratives and visualization and metaphors in other fields. All the studies I quote, those are done on text narratives. Mm-hmm. But why shouldn't they apply to comics? Or the metaphor studies, again, it's very text-based. Or on the other side, visualization studies are often done on diagrams. Those have been quantified and they've been shown to improve memory, retention. But I feel we could also extrapolate from those and say, look, comics kind of mix all these things, so why shouldn't they work?
So just to clarify, this was not about how do you get more governmental grants, but how do you make a field sustainable to create a Marvel or DC of science or medical? In years to come.
Seriously. Do we want a Marvel and DC?
Well, the only way this will work is if you have a quantifiable added value and you go into commercialization on that side that actually gets in capital other than Kickstarter campaigns, which have a ceiling.
I don't know. Maybe does anyone else want to answer to that? I don't.
Well, I mean, I think that the big chunk of the game is just to be entertaining as all hell. Because I'm a comedian, I do science communication, but nobody cares about what I have to say if I don't make them laugh. The game, I don't really particularly care about the graphic medicine if the graphics aren't fun. Yeah. And so that it doesn't require necessarily, value added. Because if we are entertained, I think that entertainment is something that clearly people are willing to pay huge amounts of money for.
That's the value.
Well, I mean, at that point, yes. But I mean, I'm just saying that I think that the trick to all of it, to science communication and effective graphic communication, is to be really, really entertaining, have really good, fun pictures to watch.
Yeah, another distinction, just briefly, another distinction that I try to make, and I think is very important, and you're stressing it, is what are we trying to measure? Because you're talking about education values, probably, like memory, retention, and knowledge acquisition, but that may not be the goal. I mean, orthographic medicine actually is about healthcare, patient well-being, or in my case, I'm trying to measure also engagement, which is the super soft measure. But if you read one of these things, are you more likely to read than the New York Times article about science? That's another measure. Or entertaining. Would people watch more of the same thing? Those are other things we should measure, I think, and they're not the numbers we look in education, but there's still a value for those.
Mm-hmm. You wanted to add something?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just, do you want me to add it?
I don't know. I guess you probably should. I don't know. I need to hear from the gurus who tell me about that. But.
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. The man behind the curtains. Yes.
I'm Alexandra Alberta. I'm in Bournemouth University, and I just wanted to add that I think where we're seeing change in the UK, especially with science, is in the last year and a half. Graphic Social Science has also looked at graphic medicine, and they're looking at how graphic medicine has built as a field to get it in there. And I was a part of the second meeting where we set down a guideline and was brought in to talk about graphic medicine. and we brought in publishers, and I thought bringing in the publishers was probably the most helpful thing of that day, because the publishers started saying that they were all fine with all of these ideas, but we needed to prove to them that the ink that would go on the page was just as valuable as a journal article's ink. First of all, I have some problems with seeing why that's a big issue. But what I have seen happening with other people, after this, it got me thinking about publishers and those restraints of how we get this information out. And I believe, I hope I'm getting this right, Taylor and Francis has recently come out with making your abstracts graphic, regardless. And you should, if you haven't seen this, you should look up the abstracts that they put out for their guide. But it's starting to see this change of proving with where you want the outputs to be that the graphic format is working. And it is building, but I think that looking at that and looking at where your outputs are going out and where you want them to go out, we're never gonna have a blanket answer for anything. But proving that the medium itself is going to be useful at these different places, and referencing that if you go to one publisher saying, well, Taylor and Francis is doing it, and kind of playing that game a little bit. But it was, the interesting thing of that day was addressing it at the publishing level that I thought was really useful.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, this is a great conversation. I like
Hi,
Just
I'm
keep
Kevin Wolf. I was wondering if you've ever heard of Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sanders' book, Surfaces and Essences, analogy as the fuel and fire of thinking. Basically, their conclusion is that anything, any form of thinking or learning that we develop is all through analogy or metaphor. That's how we collect information. And then my second question is whether you think, because I've heard tales of this, that people who have multi ways of thinking are less likely to get Alzheimer's or dementia. That would include people who know multi-languages, who, maybe they're mathematical as well as artistic, that sort of thing.
Okay, no, yeah, that's good. The first question, I haven't read that, but I knew that, Hofstadter wrote out about analogy. So yeah, it's a huge field. I just mentioned the Lakoff and Johnson because they are the most popular, but sort of like, psychology, philosophy of science, looking at metaphors as a tool for thought. I should look it up. The second question, again, I'm not an expert in any of this. I have no medical background at all. I knew I was following the bilingual research because I'm bilingual, and it's not that clear, the evidence. I hope they're right. But then, I mean, I don't know. In general, like, the only thing I can say for sure that the brain is, this is the idea of plasticity in the brain. The more you use it, the more it keeps these neurons and this connection active. So I don't know really if we can talk about different ways of thinking or like multiple languages, but even just like the silly suggestions, like, I don't know, take a different road to work every day, I think that they make sense. They're not proven, but looking at how the brain works, I wouldn't be surprised if they improve long-term health.
Hey, I'm Justin Kreuter. I was wondering if you could, I was really excited about your idea of dialing in your metaphor, and I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on your process for that. How have you've gone about doing that and working towards a more successful metaphor?
Well, thanks for the question. That's something, I'm thinking a lot about, because as I mentioned, when I wrote Neurocomic, I wasn't really thinking about, I didn't know anything about metaphors. And that's partly why I wanted to stress this point here with like community cartoonists, because I think we all do it all the time, but we don't really think it through. It's just part of the language. We come up with metaphors, and that's fine. But I'm saying when it comes to science communication, we should think more carefully. So now I'm trying to, after I read this literature, I started to think, like, when I storyboard, I come up with a metaphor, but then I stop and think, is there any other metaphor? Which one is better? Like, it would be great if someone can develop kind of like a process to like evaluate these things. I think at the moment it's just like up to us to really like spend 5 more minutes instead of just going with the first metaphor thinking about considering all the potential ramification. And just, again, I would love to make this research more accessible, because at the moment it's very academic psychology research, but there's a lot there's more and more being done on metaphoric framing, so like police framed as warriors or protectors, crime as a virus, and these things do have effect on the way people perceive and think about these subjects. So just being aware of these things.
Carol Hendrickson. One of the things that is really striking me or bringing to mind is the pleasure of revelation, so that metaphors, there's something about a revealing aspect of it. And one of the things I remember in my own education was hearing a talk by Emily Martin, anthropologist.
I was just going to mention that. Thank you.
Yes, what's it, Romancing the Sperm?
The Sperm and the Egg.
The Sperm and, yeah. Where she sort of reveals, I first heard it as a talk, reveals the heavily gendered language behind biological reproduction, with the docile egg, with the corona, and the sperm, like knights traveling down the fallopian tubes to conquer this maiden, and how you can use different metaphors for getting different ways of thinking of scientifically. And so that really struck me. I brought it into my classroom. Students had these aha moments. So as a person creating these narratives, how to get those, the timing, the narrative timing of those aha moments, and then how to deliver them to people so that there's a kind of joy and a horror, like, oh man, I've been thinking this way my whole life, and how can I change? But there's a kind of pleasure pain. So as a narrative, how do you think about the trajectory to get that?
So you're saying also, like, how do you introduce the metaphors, maybe like challenge some existing metaphors?
Yeah, how to reveal it so that people get it, and that there's a certain pleasure as well as maybe
like figuring it out.
Other emotions.
I don't have a good answer, but it's a very good point. And I mean, just also connecting to the previous question, I think, it's also useful to kind of challenge some of the existing metaphors, because there are so many things that are part of a language and we don't even think about them anymore. But I think there's a big role for historians, STS scholars, like just to like point them out, and I mean, for us doing science communication in comics or otherwise, just maybe even just instead of going with the first metaphor we are used to, think about those and find an alternative one. I mean, there are so many, like, I forget the author, but illness as metaphor. Sontag, like that's another great book about, relevant for graphic medicine, how diseases often become metaphor or something else, and how we, again, part of our language is derived from this, and we don't even really challenge it anymore. So it's a lot of work.
Just, to continue on the metaphor,
Say your name.
Carolina Nadel. So the focus of the metaphor or the abstract, because for example, Save the Planet, there was an op-ed piece a couple of months ago in the New York Times about how the planet will continue. It doesn't matter. Humans will not be able to maybe live on the planet. And that's, so that's really important too.
Yeah, I always loved that quote. I think it was George Carlin that like popularized it, the joke. Like the planet is fine. Like we need to see the. I mean, just thinking more careful. I don't know. Now we are getting to language territory, which is not my expertise. But I think there is like a parallel argument to be made about visuals. So visuals are often metaphorical and.
There is somebody at this conference who's going to be presenting at some point. Her name is Steph Link, and what she's doing is wordless comics that work heavily with metaphor to talk about mental illness and mental states. So you should take a look out for her. She's interesting in doing some of that work. Any other comments? Yes.
It's just a question. It was mentioned a couple times that fear campaigns don't work. Do you know anything about that? Do you know why they don't work? How we know fear campaigns don't work?
I don't know. I mean, again, I didn't look at all the research.
Oh, yes. Okay, you should go up there and say it again. To capture it, yes, Aaron. Remember, we're trying to capture
Sorry,
voices.
it has been mentioned earlier that fear campaigns don't work, and I was just wondering if you were apprised of any of the research about fear campaigns and how we know they don't work.
Okay.
Fantastic, thank you.
I don't have to answer again.
No, you don't have to answer again because you're captured. Anybody else? Oh, yes?
Can I make a comment?
Yes. Oh, it's Wizard of Oz. Oh, no, it's Ryan. Ryan, please do.
Now you can see the screen.
Yes.
Yeah?
We see you.
Yep.
Yes.
Up.
But not my
Nope.
screen.
No.
There's your screen.
No, unless it's Logos Spermaticos. Is that what you're sharing?
Yeah. It's an article.
Cool.
It's an article in Diacritic. Similar to work by Emily Martin. The other thing I wanted to mention was there was this exhibition at the Wellcome Institute on Can Graphic Design Save Your Life, which I think very much addresses the question of whether or not fear tactics work. There's finished.
Yeah, I wish you'd seen that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Was this film about a facility in Finland called Onkalo. And what they're doing there is they're burying all of Finland's nuclear waste miles below the surface of the Earth. And they were presented with the problem, how do you communicate with generations that are so far forward, as it says, 100,000 years, where we don't know what language they'll speak, we don't know whether they'll use language, it'll probably be a post-textual, if not a post-literate culture. And what all the solutions they came up with were visual language. So when trying to deal with the question of how to communicate with the future, at least, the question seems to have been settled in some respects, at least, by that this kind of forced experiment. And just one more thing I wanted to mention. This, you're probably familiar with Life Animated, both the book and the film. It's based on the book by Huskind, and I think this also very directly addresses the question of what's going on in the brain in terms of processing visual images, and perhaps looking at autism and why people with autism respond so much better to visual storytelling than to textual storytelling would go some way to answering some of the questions that Matteo brought up in his very interesting paper.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Again, did you want to ask a question? No. Okay. Anybody else? One final question. It can be. All right. We are at our time. So. Yeah. Pardon me? Oh, is there a question?
What happened to your finger?
Oh.
Just like to get in the graphic medicine mood, I sliced it up. I had 2 stitches.
Matteo had 2 stitches in his finger, which he sliced right before the conference. Okay, thank you all so much for coming, and thank these 2 wonderful presenters, Ryan Kraus, Matteo Farinella. Thank you.